Hello everyone, today we talk about John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough's Art of War. We've never really talked about this giant in English military history. It's about time we do so, as we are completing at least some general introductions about 18th century warfare that, as you know and understand, is pretty dense, even just documentary compared to, say, our more frequent medieval warfare. Looking at a particular perspective of this commander's achievements that not just brought him to the firmament of the great generals of his era, but also is very typical and at the same time characteristics of this era in the art of war, and in fact John Churchill's way to it respectively. As we'll go on, we'll see essentially what I mean by this. Now, during the closing decades of the 17th century and the opening years of the 18th, the predominant motive in the political landscape of Europe revolved around the intense competition between the Habsburg dynasty and the Bourbon house. Reason for which, in general, in order to understand the art of war, we will here not pass necessarily through the entire life of John Churchill, that if anything we can do a video about at some point, but rather how he basically manifested within this context and the enormous power that he also accumulated. He was at some point the richest man in Europe, as you know, also a prince of the empire, not just a subject of the British monarchy. You know the story in the Anglo-American world that is primarily constituting my audience background. I presume that everything is pretty well clear. I'm of course amazed at the fact that most of the times it's not really the case, but we're not going to digress specifically on this. If you're interested in the era, by the way, I made multiple videos about not just late 17th century warfare, mostly revolving around the siege of Vienna, but also a couple of videos introducing the splendid war of the Sun King that Marlborough basically spawns in. In 1665, the ailing and hairless Habsburgic ruler Charles II ascended to the Spanish throne. All right, you know that there were two branches since Charles V's reparations for his son and brother. And although Spain had long since relinquished its status as the world's foremost imperial force, and or at least the one that could aim at that hegemonization, it continued to function as an expansive worldwide federation encompassing territories in Italy, the Spanish Netherlands, the Philippines, and substantial portions of the Americas. We shall talk more about Spanish warfare, including the post-Rocroi one, because it's not like Spain went down overnight for some reason. It was still a might to be reckoned with, and it would join forces with the French for dynastic reasons. Remarkably durable, the Spanish Empire endured with minimal erosion upon Charles's demise in 1700. In fact, it had even broadened its reach in regions such as the Pacific. Control over this domain held the potential to tip the scales, at least of the continental equilibrium, that at this point revolted, as we explained, mostly towards France or Austria, the latter springing out of its sort of former feudal intricacies and limitations, and in fact hegemonizing a great part of Central Europe, while having to cope with the instead continentally hegemonic force of France, together with all a series of allies in the effort. Efforts to divide the Spanish realm among claimants from France and Austria that obviously were vying for, in fact, an inheritance of Spain, or to elevate a contender, if anything, from the Bavarian Wittelsbach line, ultimately collapsed. Upon his passing, Charles bequeathed his crown to the grandson of Francis Louis XIV, who assumed the title of Philip V of Spain, Bourbon. We are on November the 16th, 1700. This changed everything. Famously enough, Louis XIV, after the very apropos phrase, il n'y a plus de Pyrénées. There are no Pyrenees anymore, as that chain had historically largely contributed to the separation of Spain and France. Yet another reason to show how, like in this case, geopolitics does not exist, because there's just politics, and the Bourbon came to rule in both lands. Now, naturally, not without sort of complications. It's not like everything was blended in together. If anything, we'll talk about this as well. And this obviously enormously favored the Sun King. Right? This inheritance came with the stipulation that Philip relinquish any pretensions to the French succession. However, de facto, the Bourbon could gather forces from the Spanish Empire, and at that point reinforcing their position in the Old World in particular. Louis' choice to disregard this proviso, by the way, yet again imperiled Europe's subjugation to French hegemony further, and prompted the reconstitution of the Grand Alliance in 1701. This was yet another coalition of forces, mostly, in fact, like Austria, the Netherlands, various different principalities, with Britain obviously being interested in checking the French expansion. So having this historical, especially from this point onwards, propension at preventing the hegemonization of the continent to preserve her own insular independence. The war known as the One of the Spanish Succession ignited thus in 1701, with Britain holding off on its formal declaration until the year later. True to form, the underlying disputes were labyrinthine, yet the core impetus lay in Louis XIV's drive to elevate France to unrivaled supremacy across the continent, which his enormous army was definitely ready to do. All right, we'll talk more also and better about the Dutch army of this era that achieves basically the greatest, say in terms of cost benefits, economic ratio, peak in military history. Right, if that wedge crumbled, like basically the French could swarm across the rest of Europe, and especially threatened from a British perspective with a Dutch navy, the same England, which had historically been also threatened more often than we realized at the point. Specifically, Louis at this point pressed the Spanish crown upon his grandson. This gambit drew fierce resistance from Austria, occasionally termed the Holy Roman Empire, which championed her own aspirant to the throne, as well as from Britain and the Dutch United Provinces, both intent on averting any disruption to the prevailing power balance that they would have otherwise been the first ones to be affected by. From these tensions emerged the Grand Alliance. Numerous lesser European principalities, of course, joined the fray as well. This is regardless of we are in the 18th century, the age of the Enlightenment, not quite even at the very beginning, the way we intend. But so we are all projected, in any case, in a modern secular direction, past confessional wars, at least by some degree. In reality, this is the very old European ancien regime, feudal, in some ways farraginous world in terms of political alliances, of general diplomatic interaction, of military possibilities. Yet one that was starting to move an unprecedentedly large amount of forces. You know that during the War of the Spanish Succession, basically, even up to hundreds of thousands of men were fielded on a single campaign, in a single battle, even possibly in a single army. This is also a moment in history where, frankly, aside from what we said at the very beginning, we don't even know everything. Like, you would think that this is, yes, a much more documented time compared, say, to the 13th to 14th century, but yet not one through which we know literally everything about what was happening on the battlefield. And some assessments naturally can be more precise, There is this general idea, but war is messy. It's messy even in a formal sense. It's mostly a gnosiological issue that starts from properly historical evidence that is complicated to browse, especially when you start having so many sources. There are also, for this reasons, some historiographical currents that tend to highlight a narrative or another, especially ever more motivated by national interest, even far ex post the events, by the way. There was a sense, naturally, of one own country's achievement. We know that prospectively, also in contemporary history, the narratives tend to sometimes be affected by some of these cliches, or at least very sort of narrow point of view. I suspect that there isn't really anyone beyond a certain moment in late medieval, early modern warfare that has actually a well-rounded up sort of understanding of every single battle from all the sources available, rather than relying on what others wrote. It's true that, again, since more has tendentially been written even about the stuff, that there isn't much of a broader mystery to solve as far as individual battles necessarily are concerned, but in a broader picture, and sometimes even for the same, but trying to understand the actual moral ratios, the strengths involved, it's complicated, and it is still subject to say, positive criticism. If we look at the international scene, Prussia aligned with the coalition, so against France, while Bavaria advanced alongside the Sun King. As William III's vitality waned, as you know, essentially the ruler both of the Netherlands and England after the Glorious Revolution, he designated Marlborough as ambassador extraordinary alongside the command of English troops to participate in the assembly at The Hague. Again, I'm not going to make a history of Marlborough before this, and there is also a very interesting military history telling the truth throughout the same Glorious Revolution, also looking at his family's background during the Civil War, etc. We just see him fairly well distinguished and also propped by different political connections, which were extremely useful for him. On September the 7th, 1701, the treaty establishing the Second Grand Alliance designated Archduke Charles, the second son of Emperor Leopold I of Austria, as Spain's rightful Habsburgic sovereign in opposition to Philip of Bourbon, because naturally, of course, the idea was that, if one of the Habsburgic branches went extinguished, at least in line of principle of seniority, the Habsburgic branch of Austria should have succeeded, but things were complicated, and in any case, it was a matter of brutal power rather than formalities, as important as this could be. The accord bore the signatures of England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire as the Habsburgs. Naturally, as we've seen, there were different powers that were not obeying Vienna. Leopold I, the patriarch of the Austrian Habsburgs, he had a very peculiar character at this point. He was very old. He would die in a few years. His approach to military policies and involvement was not that dramatic. But this was a high point in Austrian history in general. We'll see it better with when we resume, as we're going to, in fact, our series about Prince Eugene, that, as you know, is rightfully coupled with Marlborough in this faction in Europe as, in fact, one of the most successful beaters of the French, even though he came straight from Paris himself. So, in all this, the rising autonomy of the German principalities was a thing. We've seen the Bavarians casting their lot with France. Naturally, this was a consequence of the Habsburgic failure during the 30 Years' War that, if anything, maintained the status quo in terms of political and confessional autonomy of the various German princes. William III died on March the 8th, 1702, owing to wounds from a riding mishap, yielding the crown to his sister-in-law, Anne, the famed Queen Anne. Queen Anne commands and we obey over the hills and far away. Though anticipated, William's demise stripped the alliance of its clearest figurehead, if anything because he had held, as we've seen, the most important strategic powers across the Channel, and in the immediacy of the French threat, even as Marlborough's stature was bolstered by his intimate bond with the incoming sovereign, that was quite close also to, in fact, his wife in particular. They eventually ended up quarreling, but in any case, this is not what we're gonna look at least for today's video, which is not entirely, by the way, Marlborough's story here, because I'm going to make a couple of videos of the same kind, looking at the entire arc of his military, at least of his more continental military curriculum, that, in fact, today we just look in its beginning. Anne elevated Marlborough to Master General of the Ordnance, inducted him as Knight of the Garter. These were, of course, enormous privileges, and again, the man was enormously powerful, and named him, in fact, Captain General over her forces, both domestically and overseas. Right, this man was, at this point, by far one of the most influential in the world. For her part, Lady Marlborough received appointments as Groom of the Stool, Mistress of the Robes, and Keeper of the Privy Purse, yielding the pair a joint yearly stipend exceeding £60,000, which is something like at least several million pounds, dollars, euros in scale today. In the course of the war, the War of Spanish Succession, Marlborough, in tandem with Grand Pensionary Anthony Heinsius and Prince Eugene of Savoy, coalesced into the triumvirate that, across multiple dimensions, steered Europe's fortunes amid the brutal clash. On May the 4th, 1702, England issued its official declaration of war against France, vesting Marlborough with overarching authority over the Anglo-Dutch forces due to his own military reputation and the sake of unity of command and more. His elevation, however, did spark unease given his lack of prior command, at least over a field army, and his comparatively scant martial background relative to the score or more of Dutch and German commanders now subordinate to him. This was obviously a political choice more than a strictly strategical one. Furthermore, Marlborough's English origins fueled the Dutch States General's resolve to bar prioritization of British political or military agendas over Dutch ones in general, which was relatively unhelpful. Consequently, the States General imposed stringent constraints on Marlborough's command authority, codified in 12 articles. Among the most salient provisions we have Article 2, Marlborough could exercise command over Dutch units solely within the integrated Anglo-Dutch field army. So as a commander-in-chief of the army in the field, and in the theater, not much as a broader sort of generalissimo with political discretion. Article 3 was he was compelled to devise operational strategies in concert, in fact, with the senior Dutch general, who in turn could solicit input from subordinates, so de facto limiting also Marlborough's full military command. Article 4, every determination required consensus with the Dutch general and field deputies. So further limitations. Article 4, Marlborough was barred from issuing directives to Dutch troops absent the involvement of their superior officers, ever more stringent. And as the paramount leader of the Anglo-Dutch army, he was obliged to harmonize all strategies with the top Dutch commander, could direct other Dutch officers only amid joint combat operations. Should discord arise between Marlborough and the Dutch general, he lacked the means to enforce his vision. Especially the circumstance on the continent with the full might of the French army against this coalition. It was impossible just to quarrel at that point. But this also did not really help the mood at some point. Resolution fell to the Dutch deputies, emissaries of the States General, for the ultimate verdict. This arrangement necessitated frequent recourse to Marlborough's diplomatic finesse and rhetorical skill. The guy was quite sort of smart, right? Smart, kind of intelligent. In order properly to secure endorsement from the embedded Dutch field deputies, they were extremely careful about their military organization, administration, in some sense even before the broader political and strategical reasons that were, however, that pressing, especially for them. At least England had quite a wide moat to protect her from France. The Netherlands had, yes, lots of canals, but, it was an entire landmass connected to the continent. It was being hegemonized by the Sun King. In 1702, London dispatched John Churchill to the United Provinces to lead the Anglo-Dutch operations. His mandate encompassed two aims: foremost, to thwart French subjugation of the United Provinces. Obviously enough, such a conquest posing an unacceptable peril to the English Channel due to the might of Dutch naval infrastructure and just also to some extent geographical position. And secondly, to bolster Austria. That was, of course, in turn bolstering the alliance. The Dutch fixated chiefly on the specter of French incursion, as they were so close to the French landmass, yet notwithstanding their early torpor, Marlborough's inaugural Allied thrust in the Low Countries, the war's chief arena, as you know, unfolded auspiciously. Right, a few theaters like Flanders have been so intensely soaked in blood in European history, especially in some of the most recent one, as you know, in the centuries. By outflanking Marshal Boufflers, he coordinated with Athlone to seize Venlo, Roermond, Stevenswert, and Liège, earning him a ducal proclamation from a thankful queen in December. Right. If you're interested, by the way, in Vauban's fortification system, what general warfare in this era was up to, we talk about Marlborough in that video as well, about Prestre. And in general, that there was really a lot of siege warfare, so that the front did not really dramatically extend in depth. More than much at some point, right, at the same Paris risked being captured, the same Netherlands to be conquered. But at the same time, it was a very attritional type of warfare with a stark preponderance of sieges, as opposed that would be fought in the tens, as opposed to battles that were not even a handful, like even in Marlborough's career, as we will see now. Now, this Anglo-Dutch political strategic arrangement necessitated frequent discourse to Marlborough's, as we've seen, diplomatic finesse, rhetorical skill. On February the 9th, 1703, shortly following the Marlborough's ennoblement, by the way, their daughter Elizabeth wed Scroope Egerton, the first Earl of Bridgewater. That summer brought a betrothal between Mary and John Montagu, successor of the Earl of an eventual Duke of Montagu. They wed on March the 20th, 1705. Their elder daughters had wed earlier, Henrietta to Francis Godolphin's offspring in April 1698, and Anne to the impetuous and dissolute Charles Spencer, Earl of Sunderland, in 1700. Nonetheless, Marlborough pinned his aspirations for a storied lineage on his sole surviving male heir, John, who post-elevation carried the honorific Marquess of Blandford. Yet, during his studies at Cambridge, in early 1703, the youth of 17 contracted a dire case of smallpox. His parents hastened to his bedside, but on the morning of Saturday, February the 20th, he succumbed, casting the Duke into, quote, the greatest sorrow in the world. Right? When you are already crushed by the responsibilities of such a crucial theater of war with hundreds of thousands of men depending on you, the death of your only son, on which you repose really all your hopes of, male offspring continuity, your name, in this sense, your military might as well living in him, which was always also something very crushing even for any son of such a father, was devastating. That's why we're talking about that, because it strongly affected also John's morale. And during his anguish and entrusting Sarah to her own mourning, the Duke re-embarked for the Hague in early March, in which spirits you can imagine. Marshal Villeroy had by then supplanted Boufflers as head of forces in the Spanish Netherlands, yet despite Marlborough's conquests of Bonn, Huy and Limburg that year, the great design, the Anglo-Dutch blueprint to clinch Antwerp and thereby unlock fluvial access to Flanders and Brabant, crumbled under Villeroy's maneuvers and flawed Allied synchronization, culminating in the brink of catastrophe, a clash at Ekeren on June the 30th. This again highlights the political dangers, the strategic dangers of political division, if anything. Over the war's initial pair of years, Marlborough ventured southward, securing Cologne and Bonn. The intent was to mesh with the contingents of Prince Louis of Baden and Prince Eugene of Savoy, so securing essentially a sounder German connection on the Rhine, given that, as you know, the French were essentially controlling even part of that. The Dutch halted him, however, apprehensive, in fact, diverting the primary field army south towards southern Germany would leave the United Provinces vulnerable to French strikes. The French had from their side, again, a solid political unity. Yes, I mean, as we've seen, that they were fighting namely in the Spanish Netherlands, but de facto, like, their control was much more cohesive than the Allied one, if anything, as a great coalition against the Leviathan there. Thus, Marlborough found himself tethered near the Maas and Scheldt rivers, whereas his true imperative lay in advancing along the Rhine and Danube even to aid his Austrian counterpart that was involved, again, in Italy against the French. So there's a broader say, international scene, a complex set of theaters, also overseas for that matter, that find it their main pivot, however, around Flanders. That was rightfully, in fact, or at least in general, the most important strategic center. At home, the Duke grappled with further hurdles. In fact, the centrist Tory administration comprising Marlborough, Lord Treasurer Godolphin, and Commons speakers Robert Harley contended with obstruction and discord from their high Tory peers, whose doctrinal bent championed maximal Royal Navy deployment for mercantile gains in overseas territorial growth. In fact, this was a bit the great issue, like a big war on continental soil was too expensive for the commercially minded English Third Estate, not only, right? For the Tories, maritime endeavors trumped terrestrial ones. Instead of confronting the foe at their fortified core, they advocated striking Louis XIV and Philip V at their frailties, colonial holdings, and oceanic lanes. If you're interested in that, I made a video about the British strategy of course, much later in time, of the 7 Years of War. We also talked, however, about the history of Canada from the League of Augsburg. So there had already been some clashes that there were at this point as well in the colonies. Nevertheless, the Whigs on their own side, under their junta vanguard, ardently backed the administration's mainland thrust, right, plunging the armies towards France's vitals as well, which was probably the best policy. This backing ebbed marginally after the Allies' latest exertions, but the Duke, whose artful diplomacy had knit a fractious Grand Alliance, now commanded global esteem as a commander. He had proven his skills at that level of command, rendering 1703's modest gains swiftly overshadowed by the Blenheim offense. At some point, we will, of course, cover these battles in their brutal details and concrete tactical dimension. If anything, I made a video about the Battle of Berg. This is the only one, I think, aside from Narva, that, however, is at the very beginning of the century. So closer to this, actually, but as properly a detailed tactical analysis of some sort for 18th century clashes, but we will have to augment, especially for the Wars of Spanish Succession, not only. Squeezed by French and Bavarian pressures from the west and Hungarian insurgents from the east, because the Habsburgs had recovered a great part of Hungary from the Ottoman Empire, but of course had to cope with the generally uncivilized profile of those abodes. Again, you have Bavarian between that threatens properly also some important critical junctures between, as we've seen, the Rhine, the Danube. Austria teetered on expulsion from the war, right? Because the costs were staggering, all right? In that sense, the High Tories were actually aware, of course, of the astronomical financial resources needed to wield this enormous war. Apprehensions regarding Vienna and southern Germany's plight persuaded, however, Marlborough of the urgent need to dispatch succor to the Danube. Though deployed to wrest the offensive in turn from the adversary brimmed with audacity, to say the least, Marlborough committed from the outset to deceiving the States General, loath as they were to countenance substantial depletion of the Allied strength in the Spanish Netherlands. Toward that, he relocated English and Dutch detachments to the Moselle. This was a scheme ratified by the Haag as well, as we've seen, because it couldn't do literally whatever he wanted, yet upon arrival intended to evade Dutch oversight and veer southward, in spite of that, to rendezvous with Austrian units in southern Germany. Anthony Heinsius, the Dutch Grand Pensionary, was probably privy to Marlborough's scheme in confidence beforehand, telling the truth, because of course also the Dutch were split in different political factions over the strategies to adopt during the war. Of course, the entire international picture is interdependent, so it's just a matter of saying, but where does the enemy's Schwerpunkt lay? At the time, they didn't quite reason in Clausewitzian terms by language, unless you were German, you somehow nail it beforehand. But of course, how the way you wage war is that, just by practice, and you have always to remember that in any age in history. Through artful misdirection and masterful oversight, Marlborough realized his intent, even. Perceiving catastrophe looming should he linger immobile, Marlborough determined in 1704 to advance upon the Danube. Across the 1703-1704 winter, Marlborough's envoys and Eugene's conferred and exchanged missives, forging a blueprint for Marlborough's to descend the Rhine in relief of imperial troops beneath Eugene's edges. Because at that point, of course, also the Marlborough's troops would have been more depending on the Austrian instead. To soothe the Dutch, because of this sudden and unwanted turn, Marlborough centralized all British contingents in the Netherlands under his direct oversight and allocated 70,000 Dutch soldiers to safeguard the United Provinces. Thus, those are your soldiers in your country to protect it. I, as a British commander, take full responsibility with my English troops. Marlborough amassed the bulk of his host at Bedburg, situated 20 miles westward of Cologne. Marlborough's full complement comprised 51 infantry battalions, of which 14 were British, 90 cavalry squadrons, of which 19 were British, because of course there were also other allies at that point under his control that were in the sense also more dependent on Marlborough politically, and 38 artillery pieces. Marlborough pressed towards the Danube, attaining Amelingen by July the 1st, there merging with Eugene and Louis of Baden to Imperial Donauwörth, 15 miles eastward. Securing Donauwörth would unlock a pathway to Nordlingen while menacing Munich and Augsburg. The Bavarian Marshal Count Darko, with 14,000 troops, meanwhile was guarding Amerdingen to fence off such onslaught. A direct onslaught promised carnage, by the way, and a blockade drawn-out toil. Yet the Schellenberg loomed above Donauwörth, and capturing it would render the latter settlement impotent. Regardless of Darko at Amerdingen, that is basically something like 30 kilometers, so it's basically a day of march west. Marlborough commanded his ranks to scale the Schellenberg, and on the 2nd they did so with ferocity. Traversing 250 miles, roughly 400 kilometers from the Low Countries, the Allies clashed in a sequence of skirmishes against Franco-Bavarian arrays deployed athwart them on the Danube. The premier substantive clash unfolded at this point. July 2nd, 1704. As Marlborough and Prince Louis of Baden overran the Schellenberg elevations at Donauwörth. Donauwörth yielded swiftly, paving Marlborough's route to his signature triumph. 5,000 had been lost per side at the Schellenberg, by the way, but the strategic imperative was greater. Marlborough had to break through and support Prince Eugene. In fact, on August the 12th, he conjoined with the Savoy-Carignano's command to bar Marlborough's further progress. The French chief Count Camille de Taillard advanced from the west to menace Donauwörth. Taillard demurred from preferring combat outright. Nonetheless, Marlborough forded the river Lech into Bavaria and laid waste to the landscape to provoke the French. Scorched earth strategy in that area was aimed at reducing, in fact, the French logistical supplies capabilities. Retaliating, Taillard fused with Marshal Marsin and Bavaria's elector, interposing his host betwixt the Allies and the Danube. Taillard's amalgamated array approached 60,000 strong. This was essentially aimed at severing the enemy supply lines from, say, the lower Danube. This is also quite the one of the goals, at least of the armies of the time. They were pretty big, in this sense also unwieldy, not disorderly, but cumbersome, right? Heavily depending on logistical lines, trying to outflank them, especially in a context like this, where advances across pretty wide theater were relatively sudden and bold. On the 12th of August, Taillard proceeded to Blenheim, a village for bivouac, fundamentally. The Franco-Bavarians assumed a formidable stance fronted by the river Nebel, flanks buttressed by the Lutzingen village leftward and Blenheim rightward, Oberglau constituting a redoubt centrally. Marsin and the elector oversaw the span from Lutzingen to Oberglau. Taillard instead the eastern expanse. He quartered 9 battalions in Blenheim, flanking them with 7 additional, and retained 11 cavalry squadrons in abeyance. The Blenheim-Oberglau frontage boasted 44 cavalry squadrons backed by 9 infantry battalions in reserve. 14 infantry battalions manned Oberglau itself. On his left, Taillard stationed 32 further cavalry squadrons beneath Marsin plus 17 infantry battalions. Encircling Lutzingen, directly under the Elector of Bavaria's helm, stood 51 cavalry squadrons. 12 infantry battalions garrisoned the settlement. Come the morning of August 13th, Marlborough and Eugene propelled southward with 52,000 personnel and 66 ordnance pieces to assail the Franco-Bavarian array at Blenheim. The stratagem embodied quintessential Marlborough: Eugene to buffet and immobilize foes westward of Oberglau, Marlborough to assail the leftward stretch from Oberglau to Blenheim. There are two essentially equally split sectors, Marlborough in the west, Eugene in the east. Marlborough arrayed his sector in 4 echelons. Foremost advanced 17 battalions to claim the Nebel's southern bank, trailed by 35 battalions and 36 cavalry squadrons in the second and third to drive the principal thrust. The rearmost, comprising 11 infantry battalions, leftward, Marlborough arrayed a formidable detachment under Lord John Cutts, charging him with hemming the French in Blenheim proper. From 8:30 a.m., mutual barrages of cannonade rent the air. As Eugene propelled forward, Cutts breached the Nebel and secured a barricade before Blenheim, his ranks weathering relentless musketry and shot. Circa 12:30 p.m., tidings reached that Eugene had engaged and fastened the Bavarian ranks eastward of Oberglau. Marlborough mobilized. To mask his Nebel transit, he bade Cutts dispatch a brigade against Blenheim. Thus, General Rowe spearheaded his brigade into withering French ordnance. Rowe and a third of his complement perished, yet his brigade doggedly surged onward. French horse proximate Blenheim rallied only to be repelled. A second French equine sally fell to British cavalry northward of the hamlet. Abruptly, peril engulfed the Allied midpoint. Prince of Holstein-Beck hurled 10 infantry battalions in a headlong charge upon Oberglau, rebuffed at grievous cost, exposing Marlborough's centre right. Marcin lunged with 32 cavalry squadrons. Marlborough countered by summoning Eugene to dispatch Fugger's cuirassiers thither for riposte. As Marcin's troopers gained the Nebel's southern shore, Fugger sheared their leftward flank and ejected them riverward. Holstein-Beck regrouped his foot and repulsed the French infantry into Oberglau. By 3 p.m., the bulk of Franco-Bavarian foot huddled in village strongpoints or transfixed by Eugene. Climax beaconed. Marlborough conveyed his full midpoint over the Nebel, 90 cavalry squadrons and 23 infantry battalions. He disposed them in 4 ranks, vanguard pair cavalry, rearward duo infantry. At 4:30 p.m., Marlborough unleashed thus his corps. Thrice French musketry hurled back Marlborough's mounts. Marlborough advanced his batteries and at point-blank unleashed grape shot in 2 French ranks. This volley, shielded by ordnance, saw Marlborough's horse crash upon French cavalry, dispersing them, French foot yielding likewise. This was the paramount clash of August the 13th. Marlborough, with the aid of Prince Eugene of Savoy, the faithful imperial servant, administered a shattering repulse to Marshal Tallard's and Bavaria's electors' host. Blenheim thus represents the opening, if you want, of almost a new phase of warfare, at least with this duo, representing, in fact, a further stage in European history as far as the aforementioned sort of alignment of previous, now here we say Protestant with Catholic powers. It had already been happening, as a matter of fact. But at this point, also by an Austrian power that was transcending basically any other consideration to hold the advance of an apparently unstoppable France. Highlighting the crisis, if you want, of the older imperial ideal, what had happened to Central Europe to be threatened at this point by a French onslaught. This had basically never materialized in overly concrete terms, even during the 30 Years' War, before the French adventures in Germany were threatening and dangerous, but not at this point to properly swarm across the entire region and collapsing the resistance of an entire chunk of Europe. This is what will fully materialize under Napoleon, by the way. The entirety of the offensive, loaded by different authors, for example, the chronicler John A. Lynn, as preeminent in pre-Napoleonic marches and combats, exemplified logistical, tactical, and operational mastery. Blenheim's triumph reshaping the war's trajectory. In fact, Bavaria exited the fray at this point. Louis XIV's swift conquest dreams dashed as a consequence. It would be the last time that Marlborough and Prince Eugene will inflict the Spain on the French. And the biggest was yet to come, by the way. Deeming ruin inexorable, Marsin and the Elector decamped, abandoning Tallard by way to solitary defense in Blenheim at that point, and a bolstered Amply, Katz compelled Tallard's capitulation. That's how probably the battle ended. And so if we look at the aggregate Allied toll, so British and say Northern Allies, so to say, plus the Austrians, we have 4,500 slain, 2,500 maimed, 2,000 British among them. The French aggregate is 15,000 slain, wounded or absent, plus 15,000 ensnared. The Allies seized 200 standards, 50 cannon, the full baggage convoy. There are, pretty good reflections on this battle. Historian Philip J. Hytherthwaite observes, quote, "For the first time in 40 years, a major French army had been routed, destroying their reputation of invincibility. Vienna was saved, and Marlborough's reputation was assured." Given that these battles were becoming historically ever bigger, a showdown between nations acquired ever more tactical meaning. That is to say, like as a whole evaluation of this army's performance, you could essentially look at who had the upper or lower hand in terms of morale, of organization, and more. Consider that Western warfare was very homogeneous. So basically, this also allows for us to understand better even what could be the differences given that between these forces, given that the plateau was relatively similar. If you're interested, I made a video about probably the French, in fact, English and Dutch firepower doctrine that had been historically very important. There is already some this doctrinal competition and catching up with each other's achievements, right? And there are all phases, in fact, in warfare that are sort of more or less recognizable and recognized as having witnessed a greater or lesser quality and superiority and inferiority compared to your enemy. Now, subsequent captures of Landau on the Rhine alongside Trier and Trarbach on the Moselle enshrined Marlborough as epoch's premier warrior. Even Tories who had vowed to, quote, break him up like hounds on a hare upon failure could scarcely curb their nationalistic acclaim in front of such a brilliant British success. Marlborough prevailed by cleaving the enemy midpoint, obliging Franco-Bavarian retreat lest piecemeal annihilation. And this hinged on Eugene's fierce onslaught upon the Franco-Bavarian left as well, deluding Tallard into mistaking it for the primary drive. Accolades likewise to Katz, who withstood, then assailed with brilliance rightward. Thereby Marlborough pierced the core. Though carnage abounded, of course, there wasn't much other way to break through, given the aforementioned tendential symmetry between the hosts. Marlborough disdained his toll, all right, or at least it really provided with a strategic success. The Danube was largely secured for the Habsburgs. The French had to withdraw to their interland position, or at least a narrower outer frontier. Battles like Blenheim, of course, like we look at the tactical alchemy, you realize that infantry shouldered the fray's weight, right? But cavalry was still, and we've seen it also in the videos about the French musketeers of the Maison de Roi, that were protagonists in different engagements, in fact, of the greatest of the era as well, would constitute the coup de grace, right? It was a heavily combined armed tactics. Cavalry was still a pretty strongly aristocratic business, and as you know, the mounted army had been consistently coming back, especially from the mid 17th century. If you're interested, I discussed mostly the tactics of Gustavus Adolphus, but it was something that was, in any case, already trending since the mid 16th century, to tell you the truth. Queen Anne bestowed upon her darling the regal estate of Woodstock alongside vows of a splendid edifice memorializing his Blenheim feat. Yet, post-accession, her rapport with Sarah had steadily cooled. The Duke and Duchess ascended to eminence in no small measure via their affinity with Anne, but the Duchess's unyielding assault on Tories — Sarah was a staunch Whig — estranged her from the Queen, whose innate leanings favored Tories bulwarks of the Church of England in particular. There were also some personal issues, rivalries, jealousies. Anne was not particularly stable. So, in a moral sense, she was a sovereign now, and shed of her erstwhile diffident youth so pliable to her commonly a companion, word of Sarah's indiscreet partisan railing and mounting hauteur, right, as if she was the actual queen, portends in ensuing years of their amity's ruin and her spouse's stature's erosion. The Duke of Marlborough waged virtually every conceivable battle variant. We will see him quite involved in other clashes, in other videos. But what we have observed, for example, for Schellenberg on July the 2nd, 1704, and at Blenheim on August the 13th of the same year are really impressive. In the first instance, his legions assailed and claimed a stoutly entrenched eminence. At Blenheim, Marlborough clinched a classic pitched contest. You've seen a lot of back and forth, a lot of probably muscular force involved in iron, pretty bloody iron arms. And it was that back and forth, that sort of continuous, relentless hitting the enemy, accepting the cost of bloody advances under fire, cavalry punches, and more that really tested who had the strongest backbone. Superficially disparate, Marlborough's triumph recipe endured steadfast. Having grasped tactical primacy, he maneuvered to divert foe focus and foot reserves from the lines hurt via protracted flank barrages. These persisted amid grievous attrition, as we've seen, and with reserves so committed, he struck a pivotal central juncture. So it's not like, of course, in greater strategic principles, something new. Especially the bigger the battle, the more sort of textbook it is. But in order to coordinate this, right, you really need a massive moral force. You really must have a capacity to take decisions under an incredibly heavy fire, not just material, I would say, not just metaphorical, but that's exactly the point. You're under an immense pressure in the culminating moment of the attack. It feels as if everything was crumbling around you. If you can't hold yourself in that moment, with the responsibility of the entire force under you in a broader political, strategical, historical term, like, you can't properly do this. So these men were of an enormous moral stature that we can barely imagine. Upon rending the adversary array, Marlborough then dispatched cavalry squadrons rearward, trailed by additional foot to sustain the rift, and that's what eventually culminated as employees sundering the enemy's stances under and sealing victory. Adversaries Marlborough vanquished leaned towards prudence, right, for different reasons. Prizing hazard aversion over conquest. This is arguably what saved Paris that was threatened multiple times. If you look at Louis XIV's generals, you realize that by temperament, they were basically all very cold people, a bit like the Sun King himself. Perhaps just Vauban was a bit more fiery and energetic. But they stood their ground, they cooled off, they were able to take incredibly brutal traumas, as we've seen, especially like the Battle of Malplaquet is one of the best. Is the best example, telling the truth, and showed that even though the French had stepped up in terms of military power, it's also increasing by scale their forces and, in a sense, diluting them to some qualitative point of view, because the strategic quantity in absolute terms was sort of enough. Like, they still displayed a pretty solid backbone. And in general, the French military had a hell of a military reputation and history at this point. When you look at the Allied forces, you realize that there was some greater quality, aggressiveness. At the end of the day, the greater balance was normal. There are ways to interpret eventually this era, etc. You can look at France dramatically in depth in itself, risking revolution. Actually, under the Sun King's reign alone, thrice, right? So everything came at a huge cost, as a matter of fact. Louis XIV is an underappreciated figure because, in general, the Anglo-American world, the idea is that the French are, the bad, the pervert, the degenerate, modernistically leaning, whatever. We should say something here about the religious situation siding involved a bit, but a bit like the Austrians, right? It's also like Prince Eugene. Why is it so more famous, for example, in the world for many reasons, but why also in the Anglo-American world? Because of Marlborough, because otherwise probably would have not. I mean, how much have you... I mean, Turenne is, of course, very famous, but how much publicized is Montecuccoli either? There are so many great commanders that deserve attention because they were really enormous figures, and that, however, for a slightly different national background, bias of historiography and more, haven't been fully celebrated. The same Marlborough at some point also had his own failures, right, that also make you wonder some levels of organization of landings. Okay, we'll perhaps see this in another video, but it's what I was talking about at the beginning. We should read military historical analysis with some sort of more crudely objective and especially compared and diachronic method and perspective, which is very difficult to do on YouTube. I mean, here I'm just talking about Marlborough because I had never done it before. I talked Malplaquet, I think, in a Q&A. We, of course, address him in general, but I thought it was about time we would start a little serious about his not so little accomplishments. And there is something about him, like an invariable assault, right? If anything, because he had also the initiative in many ways, and even should foes seize initial impetus, they forfeited it post haste. Marlborough's distinction lay in embracing peril for conclusive dominion, rendering his engagement riveting. And he fought against so many different types of battles within, however, the general picture of this era that was, as you've seen, relatively constrictive, because big engagements were sort of auspicable just in moments where there was just an enormous force concentration and expendability, which just by some strategic necessity, if you look at Marlborough's offensive, could simply be halted behind sieges, right? It was enough. Like, you already knew that even if you lost, I don't know, this or that fortress that could be so important in Flanders, because think about Maastricht, there are some centers that really have that Namur, that there are so many different also literary references to the stories. Tristram Shandy, like those are lovely. But you know that even in these incredibly bloody sieges, the general the calculation could be very cynical. Like, you knew that an army of that scale, while being involved in this quite intense endeavor, could and would stay there for a given amount of time that was enough to seal, for example, the season, the actual time of these engagements. So it's relatively, and everything could be cynically calculated because the political picture could change from a time to another. Sieges were incredibly bloody and brutal, costly. They bled entire countries wide. So in terms of financial resources, we've seen, of course, that was a problem even for the thriving British at this point in history. There's a lot of stepping up in the scale, probably, of military capability, especially this is in British history an incredibly turning point. And Marlborough, in that sense, incarnates that springing force, right? And as you know, he will remain a giant in European military history, the reason for which, of course, we're very happy to talk about him, and surely we will do it in increasing depth at some point. These videos are just generally presenting, and bit by bit, to see essentially what was going on just in introductory terms. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.